clinking of silverware against fine porcelain was the loudest sound in the dining room, a sharp, rhythmic punctuation to the heavy silence that always preceded one of my mother's family summits. I sat at the head of the table, a position I had earned by virtue of signing the mortgage, paying the property taxes, and maintaining every square inch of this 5-bedroom Victorian estate. But to the 4 people sitting across from me, my position at the head of the table was merely a geographic coincidence. My mother, Beatrice, cleared her throat, a sound like dry autumn leaves scraping against pavement. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at a yellow legal pad covered in her sharp, aggressive handwriting. Beside her, my sister Amanda was doing a terrible job of pretending to be engrossed in her phone, though her eyes kept darting toward me with a mixture of anxiety and unearned triumph. Amanda's 3 children were currently downstairs, making a sound like a small herd of buffalo trying to escape a collapsing barn. "Now that we're all here," Beatrice began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of a woman who had spent 40 years managing a household she didn't own, "we need to address the housing inefficiency. As a family, we have always believed in equity, fairness, and supporting one another through difficult transitions. Amanda's divorce is finalized. Her apartment lease is up next month, and bringing 3 growing children into a temporary 2-bedroom rental is simply not viable for their emotional development." I took a slow sip of my water. "I agree, Mom. That's why I told Amanda she could use the guest suite on the 1st floor for the next 6 months while she gets back on her feet. It has its own bathroom and plenty of space for a couple of bunk beds." Amanda scoffed, finally putting her phone down. "A guest suite, Clara. It faces the driveway. It gets 0 morning sunlight, and the closet is barely big enough for my winter coats, let alone the kids' toys. We are talking about my children's formative years here. They need a proper environment." My brother, Richard, who had contributed absolutely nothing to the conversation or the world at large in his 32 years, nodded sagely from the corner. "She's right, Clara. We have to think about the kids. The guest suite is practically a dungeon. It's a 200-square-foot room with heated floors and a walk-in closet," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "It's nicer than the apartment I lived in during corporate training." "Be that as it may," Beatrice interrupted, tapping her pen against the legal pad. "We took a family vote before you arrived. It was unanimous. The most logical, emotionally sound restructuring of the household requires a swap. Amanda and the children will take over the eastern wing of the 2nd floor. Specifically, the master guest room and the adjacent bedroom." I paused, the water glass frozen halfway to the table. "The adjacent bedroom is Lily's room." "Lily is 7, Amanda countered quickly, her voice rising an octave in that defensive, whiny register she used whenever she was trying to steal something. "She doesn't need a 70-square-foot private balcony and an en-suite bathroom. It's absurd for one single child to have that much real estate when Leo, Toby, and Maya are forced to share a single room. Lily can move down to the 1st-floor guest suite. It's perfect for her. It's closer to the kitchen, and she won't have to walk up the stairs." "You voted," I repeated, the absurdity of the words washing over me. "The 3 of you sat down and held a democratic election regarding the living arrangements inside my house, without me." "Clara, don't be dramatic," Beatrice sighed, waving her hand as if dismissing a minor inconvenience. "We didn't include you because we knew you'd let your personal biases get in the way of what's best for the family collective. This house has always been the family anchor. We all have a stake in how it's run. It's about utility. 3 children trump 1 child. It's simple mathematics." "And what does Lily think about this simple mathematics?" I asked. "She's a child, Clara. She doesn't get a vote," Richard chimed in, leaning back in his chair with an infuriating smirk. "Besides, she'll love the downstairs room. We can paint it pink or whatever. It's a done deal. Amanda already ordered the new bedroom sets, and they're being delivered next Tuesday. We need Lily's things cleared out by Sunday night." I looked at my sister. Amanda couldn't even meet my gaze. She was already looking past me, staring at the crown molding as if mentally calculating where she was going to hang her cheap Target mirrors. They had completely, utterly forgotten the foundational reality of their existence in this house. because I had spent the last 5 years letting them believe this property was a seamless hand-me-down from our grandparents' estate. A white lie I told to spare their fragile egos from the reality that their youngest sister was vastly more successful than all of them combined. They genuinely believed they possessed a birthright to override my life. When our grandparents passed, the old house was buried under a mountain of debt, back taxes, and a reverse mortgage that would have seen it auctioned off on the courthouse steps. I was the one who secretly bought it out of foreclosure. I paid off the liens. I put the entire deed into an anonymous LLC of which I am the sole proprietor. To Beatrice, Amanda, and Richard, I was just the property manager who handled the bills using the family trust money, a trust that didn't exist. "Next Tuesday," I murmured, leaning back in my chair. "Yes," Beatrice said, capping her pen with a definitive snap. "We knew you'd see reason once the logistics were laid out. I've already drafted a chore and utility distribution schedule for when Amanda moves in. Since she's transitioning, your brother and I decided your corporate salary should absorb 80% of the increased water and electricity costs for the first year. It's only fair." I looked at the three of them. Amanda's face was glowing with the smug satisfaction of a sibling who had finally won a childhood rivalry. Richard looked bored, eager to get back to whatever video game he was wasting his life on. Beatrice looked triumphant, convinced her matriarchal authority remained absolute. "I see," I said, standing up from the table. I didn't yell. I didn't slam my hands down. I picked up my plate, walked over to the sink, and rinsed it thoroughly. "I need to go tuck Lily in. We'll discuss the finality of this vote in the morning." "There's nothing left to discuss, Clara," Amanda called out after me, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Just make sure her toys are boxed up by Sunday. I don't want my movers tripping over Legos." I walked up the grand staircase, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood. When I reached Lily's room, I opened the door softly. The room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of her cloud-shaped nightlight. She was sitting up in bed, surrounded by her books, her small face scrunched up in concentration as she drew a picture of a cat with wings. "Hey, sweetie," I said, sitting on the edge of her mattress. "Hey, Mommy," she whispered, looking up. "Our Aunt Amanda and the cousins staying forever." "Why do you ask?" "Because Leo told me today that this is going to be his room soon, and that I have to live in the basement room where the spiders are." Her lower lip trembled just a fraction, a tiny movement that ignited a cold, white-hot rage deep inside my chest. Am I being punished? I reached out, smoothing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. I took a deep breath, letting the anger crystallize into absolute, unshakable resolve. "No, baby, you are not being punished. You aren't going anywhere. This is your room, and it will always be your room. Do you trust me?" She looked into my eyes for a long moment before nodding, her little shoulders relaxing. "I trust you." "Good, now get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a very busy day." I kissed her forehead, tucked the blankets around her shoulders, and quietly stepped out of the room. I walked down the hall to my home office, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I sat at my desk, switched on the lamp, and opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I pulled out a thick black leather binder. Inside were the original deeds of purchase, the LLC registration documents, the tax certification records bearing my signature alone, and the ironclad lease agreements that Beatrice and Richard had signed 5 years ago when they first moved into the property. Leases that explicitly stated they were month-to-month tenants subject to eviction at the landlord's discretion with a 30-day notice, paying a token rent of $1 per year to satisfy legal consideration. I opened my laptop. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I drafted an email to my corporate real estate attorney, a man named Marcus who specialized in making people's legal nightmares come true. "Marcus," the email read, "I need 3 formal notices to quit drafted and certified tonight. We are initiating an immediate, unconditional lease termination for Beatrice Vance, Richard Vance, and Amanda Vance. Furthermore, I need an emergency injunction filed against any unauthorized modifications or deliveries to the property located at 1428 Elmhurst Lane. Please have the process servers ready by 8. 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. I hit send. The hum of the laptop fan was the only sound in the room as I stared at the screen. For years, I had kept the peace. I had let them play their little games of family hierarchy because it was easier than dealing with the fallout of their shattered pride. I had let my mother act like the queen of the manor, let my brother live rent-free while he found himself, and let my sister use me as a financial safety net. But they had crossed a line. They had looked at my 7-year-old daughter, weighed her worth against their own convenience, and decided she was disposable. They wanted to hold a vote. Fine. They were about to learn that in a dictatorship of one, democracy is an illusion. I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked over to the window, looking out over the moonlit gardens I had paid tens of thousands of dollars to restore. The family vote was over. My term as the quiet benefactor was officially finished. The morning sun had barely cleared the tree line when the heavy iron gates at the edge of the driveway clicked open. I stood by the kitchen window, a steaming mug of black coffee cupped in my hands, watching a sleek black sedan pull up the gravel path. 2 neatly dressed individuals in charcoal suits stepped out, holding thick manila envelopes. Marcus had been efficient. Inside the house, the silence was broken by the heavy, sluggish footsteps of my brother Richard descending the stairs, followed by the high-pitched bickering of Amanda's children fighting over a tablet. My mother, Beatrice, entered the kitchen a moment later, already wearing her crisp, tailored morning blouse, the uniform of a woman ready to manage a household she didn't own. "Clara," Beatrice said, not looking at me as she opened the refrigerator. "Did you tell the groundskeeper to move the patio furniture? Amanda needs the eastern veranda cleared for the kids' outdoor playset. It's being delivered with the beds." "I didn't tell him anything," I replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Before Beatrice could launch into a lecture about my lack of cooperation, the front doorbell rang. It was a sharp, demanding sound that echoed through the high ceilings of the foyer. "Who on earth is that at 8 in the morning?" Beatrice muttered, her brow furrowing with irritation. "Richard, get the door." "I'm eating," Richard yelled back from the dining room, his voice muffled by a mouthful of sugary cereal. With a heavy sigh, Beatrice marched toward the foyer herself. I followed her at a leisurely distance, my coffee mug steady in my hand. Amanda was just coming down the stairs, rubbing her eyes and complaining about the noise, when Beatrice opened the massive oak front door. The lead process server, a tall woman with an entirely unreadable face, held up a clipboard. "Beatrice Vance." "Yes," my mother asked, her tone immediate and defensive. "Can I help you?" "You've been served," the woman said flatly, sliding a thick envelope into Beatrice's hands. She turned her gaze to Richard, who had wandered out of the dining room with a spoon in his hand. "Richard Vance." Yeah." "You've been served." She handed him a second envelope. Then her eyes shifted to Amanda, who was freezing on the bottom step. "Amanda Vance." "What is this?" "Is this a joke?" Amanda stammered, refusing to touch the envelope as the server extended it. The woman simply dropped it onto the console table by the door, checked her watch, and made a note on her clipboard. "All parties have been formally notified. Have a good day," the server said, turning on her heel and walking back down the porch steps with her partner. "What is the meaning of this?" Beatrice demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and building rage. She ripped open the envelope, her manicured nails tearing through the heavy paper. She pulled out the legal documents, her eyes scanning the bold, capitalized text at the top of the page. "Notice to quit. An unconditional lease termination. What kind of sick prank is this, Clara?" "Did you do this?" Amanda snatched her envelope from the table, her face draining of color as she read the contents. "A temporary restraining order, an injunction against property modification. Clara, what did you do?" I took a step forward, leaning against the doorframe, entirely calm. "You held a vote last night. You decided, unanimously, to restructure the living arrangements in this house. You decided to take my daughter's bedroom, shift her downstairs, and alter the financial layout of my household to suit your needs. I'm just exercising my own vote." "Your vote," Beatrice hissed, her face flushed dark red. "You are the property manager for the family trust, Clara. You don't have the authority to evict your own family. Your grandfather left this estate for all of us. You are merely the steward of his legacy." "There is no family trust, Mom," I said, my voice deadpan and steady. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Amanda's kids seemed to stop screaming downstairs. "What did you just say?" Amanda whispered. "Grandpa died completely broke," I explained, taking another sip of coffee. "The house was buried under $200,000 of back taxes, a predatory reverse mortgage, and a dozen structural liens. The bank was 3 weeks away from putting a padlock on the front gate and selling this place to a developer who was going to tear it down and build townhouses." "That's a lie," Beatrice shouted, her voice cracking. "The lawyers told me." "The lawyers told you that the debt had been settled," I interrupted. "They didn't tell you who settled it because I asked them not to. I didn't want to humiliate you. I bought this house out of foreclosure 5 years ago. I paid off every single cent of the debt. I placed the deed into an anonymous holding company called Valhalla Holdings LLC. I am the sole shareholder, the sole owner, and the sole landlord of this entire property. You too," I pointed at Beatrice and Richard, "signed month-to-month lease agreements with Valhalla Holdings 5 years ago to establish legal residency. Your rent was $1 a year, and according to the documents in your hands, your landlord has just terminated your leases." Richard stared at the papers in his hand, his mouth hanging open. $1, I thought that was just a tax loop, Clara." "You said it was a tax loop." "I lied to save your pride, Richard, but clearly modesty isn't a trait this family possesses." Amanda was shaking now, her fingers trembling so hard the papers rustled like dry leaves. "You can't do this. You can't put us on the street. I have 3 children, Clara. We have nowhere to go. My lease is up next month." "You had a place to go," I reminded her coldly. "You had a beautiful, fully furnished 200-square-foot first-floor guest suite with heated floors and a private entrance. But that wasn't good enough for you. You wanted Lily's room. You wanted her balcony. You wanted her bathroom. You sat at my table, ate food I paid for, under a roof I own, and voted to kick my 7-year-old daughter out of her bed." "We were just trying to find a compromise," Beatrice yelled, stepping into my space, trying to use her stature to intimidate me the way she had when I was a teenager. "We are a family, Clara. Family compromises. You cannot evict your mother. It is a moral outrage. I will take you to court. I will tell everyone what a heartless, cruel monster you are." "You can try," I said, not flinching an inch. "But Marcus is currently filing the paperwork at the county clerk's office. The injunction strictly prohibits any moving trucks, furniture deliveries, or alterations to the property. If a delivery truck shows up next Tuesday with Amanda's new bedroom sets, the security team at the front gate will turn them away. If they refuse to leave, the police will be called for trespassing." "You're bluffing," Richard muttered, though there was no conviction in his voice. He looked terrified. The reality of having to find a job and pay actual market rent was finally penetrating his thick skull. "Test me, Richard," I said, staring him down until he looked away. "You have exactly 30 days to pack up your things and vacate the premises, all of you. If you are not out by midnight on the 30th day, the sheriff's department will arrive to remove your belongings and place them on the curb." "Clara, please." Amanda suddenly changed tactics, her voice dropping into a desperate, pathetic whine. She reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back, avoiding her grip. "Think about the kids. Think about Leo, Toby, and Maya. They love it here. They love the backyard. You can't do this to your niece and nephews over a silly misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Amanda. It was a hostile takeover. You just didn't realize you were trying to conquer a kingdom that belonged to the person you were robbing." Just then, light, soft footsteps sounded from the stairs. Lily was standing on the landing, wearing her favorite unicorn pajamas, clutching her stuffed cat. She looked down at the chaotic scene in the foyer, her big eyes wide with anxiety. "Mommy," she called out softly, "why is everyone screaming?" The transformation in the room was instantaneous. The fiery rage on Beatrice's face hardened into a bitter, venomous glare, while Amanda looked like she wanted to melt into the floorboards. I turned away from them, my face immediately softening as I looked up at my daughter. Nothing to worry about, sweetheart. Aunt Amanda and Grandma just received some mail. Go back upstairs and start picking out what you want for breakfast, okay? I'll be up in just a minute. Lily looked at Beatrice, then at Amanda, and finally back to me. Okay, she whispered, turning around and heading back up the stairs. The moment she was out of sight, I turned back to the 3 adults standing in my foyer. The warmth was entirely gone from my expression. 30 days, I repeated, my voice dropping to a harsh, quiet whisper that carried more weight than any of Beatrice's screaming. Not a single day more. And if I hear any of you say one more word to my daughter about her room, her house, or her living arrangements, I will have Marcus accelerate the process for an immediate breach of lease terms, and I will have you removed within 48 hours. Do I make myself entirely clear? Beatrice looked at me, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a deep, unadulterated resentment. She realized, for the very first time in her life, that her power was an illusion. The legal pad she carried, the family summits she called, the authority she claimed, it all carried exactly 0 weight against the deed to the property. She didn't answer. She turned around and marched down the hallway toward her bedroom, slamming the door so hard the chandelier above us rattled. Richard looked at Amanda, completely lost. What do we do now? Amanda didn't answer him. She just stared at me, her eyes filled with tears of anger and defeat, realizing that her grand plan to claim the eastern wing of the house had just cost her the only safety net she had left. I turned around, walked back into the kitchen, and poured the rest of my coffee down the drain. Part 1 of the vote was settled. Now, it was time to make sure they followed the rules. The 30 days that followed were the quietest the estate had ever known. The loud, chaotic ecosystem of the house had transformed into a muted, tense waiting room. Amanda's children no longer ran wild through the hallways. They were kept strictly in the lower guest suite or out in the far corner of the yard, their laughter cautious and subdued. Richard spent most of his time locked in his room, presumably scouring rental listings and realizing that his budget of $0 a month didn't afford much in the current market. Beatrice had retreated into an icy, regal silence, refusing to eat at the dining table or speak to me when we passed in the corridors. I didn't care. The silence was beautiful. Every morning, I woke up early, prepared breakfast for Lily, and sent her off to camp. The legal machinery I had set in motion was working flawlessly. Marcus had checked in twice a week to confirm that no unauthorized moving trucks had attempted to breach the front gates. The delivery company Amanda had hired to bring the new bedroom furniture had tried to drop off 3 massive pallets on week 2, but the security team turned them away at the entrance. Amanda had screamed at the guard through her car window, but the guard had simply pointed to the court order attached to the clipboard. By the 25th day, the reality of their eviction had finally dissolved their stubborn pride. The packing boxes began to appear. I stood on the second-floor landing, watching Richard drag a heavy, taped-up cardboard box out of his room. He looked exhausted, his hair messy and dark circles under his eyes. He stopped when he saw me, letting out a heavy, defeated sigh. "You really aren't going to blink, are you, Clara?" he asked, his voice completely stripped of the smug arrogance he had carried at the family summit. "You're really going to throw your own brother out?" "You threw yourself out, Richard," I replied, my hands resting calmly on the wooden railing. "The moment you sat at my table and voted to strip my daughter of her room, you decided that our family bond was transactional. You decided that numbers and utility mattered more than respect. I'm just playing by the rules you set." "I didn't think you'd actually do it," he muttered, looking down at his shoes. "I thought you were just mad. I found a studio apartment downtown. It's tiny. It smells like old takeout, and the rent is half my paycheck from the new retail job I had to take. Then it sounds like you're finally starting your adult life. Congratulations." He shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips, and dragged the box toward the stairs. There was no apology in his voice, only the sad realization that his free ride had reached the end of the line. The real confrontation, however, came on the final evening. It was the 29th night. The house was mostly empty now, stripped of the clutter and the personal belongings that had occupied its corners for half a decade. The walls felt larger, the ceilings higher, the air clearer. Lily was safely asleep in her room, entirely oblivious to the final act of the drama unfolding downstairs. I was sitting in my office when the door clicked open without a knock. Beatrice walked in. She wasn't carrying her yellow legal pad this time. Instead, she carried herself with a rigid, brittle dignity that looked like it would shatter at the slightest touch. "I hope you're satisfied," she said, her voice a low, venomous purr. She didn't sit down. She stood across from my desk, staring at me as if I were a stranger who had stolen her birthright. "Tomorrow morning, the movers arrive for my things. I am moving into a small, 2-bedroom condo with Amanda and the children. 5 of us, crammed into a space smaller than your living room. Amanda had a beautiful space here, Mom. She chose to gamble it for more." "You are a cold, calculating creature, Clara," Beatrice spat, her fingers curling into tight fists. "I raised you. I gave you everything. And you used your wealth like a weapon to humiliate your own mother. Your grandfather would turn in his grave if he saw what you've done to this family." I stood up slowly, placing my hands flat on the desk, leaning forward just enough to look her directly in the eyes. The time for being the quiet, compliant daughter was long gone. "Let's talk about Grandpa, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a razor. "Because you love to bring up his legacy. Grandpa left this house in ruins. He left it with a reverse mortgage that would have handed the keys to a bank 5 years ago. You knew that. You just chose to ignore it because looking at the numbers required you to admit that the Vance family dynasty was a myth built on credit cards and unearned pride." Beatrice opened her mouth to interrupt, but I held up a single finger, and the sheer authority in my gesture made her snap her jaw shut. "I bought this house," I continued. "I paid off the bank. I paid the back taxes. I paid for the new roof, the plumbing, the electricity, and the food you ate every single day. And for 5 years, I let you pretend. I let you hold your little family dinners. I let you act like the matriarch. And I let you believe your authority meant something because I loved you enough to protect your dignity. But you mistook my kindness for weakness. We were a family," she cried out, her eyes shining with tears of pure frustration. "We had a right to decide how to live together." "You had a right to ask," I corrected her. "You had a right to come to me, as the owner of this house and the mother of Lily, and ask if we could find a solution for Amanda's kids. If you had done that, if you had treated my daughter with an ounce of respect, I would have built a custom guest house in the backyard for Amanda and the kids. I had the blueprints drawn up last year, Mom." I was going to surprise her. Beatrice froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at me, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. You were going to build a house." "Yes," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "But you didn't ask. You held a vote. You decided that you had the power to take. You looked at a 7-year-old girl and decided she didn't matter because she was smaller than you and couldn't fight back. You showed me exactly who you are when you think you have power. And now, I am showing you what actual power looks like." Beatrice stood there for a long, agonizing minute. The anger in her eyes slowly dissolved into a profound, crushing defeat. She realized that her own greed, her own arrogance, and her own desperate need to dominate her youngest daughter had cost her everything. She had traded a lifetime of luxury and a custom home for her grandchildren for a cramped 2-bedroom condo and a 30-day eviction notice. She didn't say another word. She turned around, her shoulders slumped, and walked out of my office, closing the door softly behind her. The next morning, the moving trucks arrived at precisely 8:00 a.m. I stood on the front porch, wrapped in a warm sweater, holding a fresh cup of coffee. Marcus stood beside me, a clipboard in his hand, quietly verifying that the movers only took what belonged to the tenants. Amanda was loading her children into her car, her face pale and averted, refusing to look in my direction. Richard gave me a brief, awkward wave before climbing into his dilapidated sedan. Beatrice was the last to leave. She walked down the grand stone steps without looking back, her head held high in a desperate attempt to salvage whatever pride she had left, and climbed into the passenger seat of Amanda's car. The heavy iron gates at the edge of the driveway clicked open. The caravan of cars and moving trucks rolled out onto the main road, and with a soft, mechanical hum, the gates closed behind them, locking the world outside. "Everything is clear, Clara," Marcus said, checking off the final line on his clipboard. "The leases are officially terminated. The keys have been returned. The property is legally entirely yours again." "Thank you, Marcus. Take the rest of the day off." "My pleasure. Have a wonderful weekend." He smiled, walked down to his car, and drove away. The silence that settled over the estate was no longer tense or heavy. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a sanctuary restored. I turned around and walked back into the house, closing the massive oak door. The foyer was empty, bathed in the bright, golden morning sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows. The echoes of screaming children and bitter arguments were gone, replaced by a profound, beautiful stillness. I walked up the stairs to the second floor and opened the door to the eastern wing. Lily's room was exactly as it had always been. Her drawings were pinned to the walls, her books were neatly stacked on her nightstand, and the door to her private balcony was cracked open, letting in a gentle, warm summer breeze. Lily was sitting on her bed, her small legs swinging over the edge, brushing the fur of her stuffed cat. She looked up when I walked in, her face lighting up with a brilliant, carefree smile. "Are they gone, Mommy?" she asked softly. I walked over, sitting down beside her, and pulled her into a warm, tight embrace. I inhaled the sweet, simple scent of her shampoo, feeling the absolute certainty that I had protected the one thing in this world that mattered. "Yes, sweetie," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. "They're gone, and nobody is ever going to take your room. This is your home. It's always going to be your home." Lily smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder as she looked out the window at the vast, sunlit gardens below. The family had held their vote, and they had lost. The house was quiet, the kingdom was secure, and my daughter was safe.